Hi there, and welcome to the final panel session today of the Spectator's COP26 Summit. We have been discussing a range of topics when it comes to bringing together political and business leaders to look at how to deliver net zero by 2050, what the challenges are, and hopefully what the solutions are. I'm Katie Balls, I'm Deputy Political Editor of The Spectator, and today's discussion is centering on green and global trade. So ahead of COP26, Boris Johnson's team are going green. We've had calls to slash tariffs on green goods and hold countries accountable for heavily polluting practices. We're also seeing Britain start to reopen after COVID-19. So is the rhetoric going to match the reality? Are plans for global Britain going to take off? And in that case, is the green agenda going to become a dominant feature of our trade negotiations, of our trade policy, or a sideline strategy? And is it going to be a help or a hindrance? So what does Britain have to offer its trading partners when it comes to negative emissions and boosting global recovery? I think one of the things we're keen to talk about is a carbon border adjustment mechanism going to be something which has helped to this? Now, before we go any further, I want to say thank you to our partner Drax for sponsoring today's panel, and also say we're going to try and take as many questions as possible. I'm keen to make it very interactive. We're going to have some opening remarks, but if people have any questions come to mind at any point, you can ask a question by typing in the text box on the Spectator TV site or by emailing events@spectator.co.uk. That's events@spectator.co.uk, and we'll try and get through as many as possible. I do know when it comes to discussions like this, it can get quite techie quite quickly. So we will go and we will dive into the detail, but if you can try and keep your questions obviously as accessible, because we've got a mix of people involved in this session, that would be great. Otherwise I will then attempt to break things down. And with that, I want to introduce our esteemed panel. We'll be running till 1 p.m, no later. So discussing the topics I've just raised, we have Bimma Falami, MP for Hitchin and Harpenden, Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. He's chair of the All Parliamentary Group for Renewable Energy and Sustainable Energy, as well as the co-chair and net zero champion for the All Parliamentary Group on Fair Business Banking, along with many other roles. We also have Matthew Fell, Chief UK Policy Advisor at the CBI. Matthew joined the CBI in 1999 and has covered a range of business sectors, including manufacturing, small business and financial services, so brings a depth of knowledge to this discussion. And then we have Claire Harbord, Group Director of Corporate Affairs of Drax, and in this role she also has responsibility for sustainability, regulation, policy and compliance. And then finally, last but not least, we have Eamon Ives, Head of Energy and Environment at the Centre for Policy Studies. His research tends to focus on market-based solutions to environmental challenges. With that, I'm going to kick things off by going to each of our speakers for opening remarks, around 3 minutes. I'll be looking at my clock, before we then have a few questions, and I'm going to begin by asking Bim to talk.
Great, well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here and join you. So what is trade really about? Trade is really about, when you get underneath all the techie language and all the detail, it's really about when you are good at something, selling that service or product to a country or a place where they are less good at it in their own country, and thereby ensuring yourself being prosperous and indeed improving the lives of people in that country. On the green agenda, if we are successful with embedding the net zero ambition within our economy, and I put this as a way of effectively reindustrializing parts of the UK that maybe have suffered over the last 20, 30, 40 years, if we're successful in doing that, it will be an inherently strong part of our trade offer when it comes to dealing with other countries. And so I think that's what we need to try and achieve, though we're not there yet. Areas where this might be the case, and we may talk about them: renewable energy, wind power, solar power, indeed nuclear energy, and we may talk about that as well, hydroelectric, other types of energy, and indeed hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, the sorts of technologies that are critical if we're going to achieve net zero by 2050. These are all things that I think the UK is increasingly proving its success at. Other countries in the world are going to be making the same sort of obligations, trying to achieve the same sort of things in relation to net zero that we're trying to achieve here in this country. We can help them do that if we put this at the forefront of our trade agenda it's something that I'm sure, I hope that the government's going to do in the months and years to come.
Brilliant, thank you, Bim. Now I'm going to go to Matthew for your opening remarks.
Brilliant. Well, thanks everyone. Great to join you here today. Look, just sort of three thoughts from me to help set the scene, I think. One would just be, why do we think this is such a big part of the UK's economic future? Second, how do we really go about seizing the opportunity? And then third, what does that mean for international trade prospects and our approach? So the UK's economic future, look, just at the CBI, we've recently completed a big piece of work around what is the UK's economic future for the next 10 years. And it was really prompted by a sense that we've just got an opportunity to do things differently, a bit of a once in a generation opportunity, actually, coming off the back of Brexit, COVID, the pace of technology, and of course, the net zero imperative. Throws things up in the air a little bit and gives us a chance to think, where is growth coming from? But also, how do we commit to better growth, that Build Back Better agenda? And in doing so, what we've done is looked at where really can the UK compete and win. So it's highly ambitious, but also rooted in reality. And we've identified half a dozen opportunities or prizes that the UK can chase down. And decarbonisation, quite clearly, is one of those, and a bit of a no-brainer. When we did this piece of work, we looked at it through lots of different lenses. So individuals in society, all businesses, and then specific firms and sectors. And there's wins in it for everything. So for individuals, clearly, we think there's a big job creation story in here for the UK, as well as better air quality and therefore better living standards. But also for all businesses, it makes them much more attractive to customers, to talent, lowers the cost of capital, and so on. And then we come on to the international agenda, because if you happen to play in one of these markets, offshore wind, hydrogen, carbon capture, electric vehicles, nuclear and so on, real opportunities to win there and establish the UK as a leading net exporter. But as Bim has just said, actually, where do we seize the opportunity? Because the UK is not alone in thinking this. So we need urgency and pace to get on with the agenda. And for my money, I think it's really important that we're strong domestically on all of these things in order to be able to win internationally. So you won't find, I suspect, many, if anyone at all, in the industry who has much to argue with in the government's 10-point plan around net zero. Actually, it's great stuff. The ambition and the vision is spot on. It's all now about filling in the gaps. So on green buildings, can we get that comprehensive heat and building strategy? On carbon capture, can we confirm the new business models? On the shift to electric vehicles, can we get the gigafactories in place in time? It's all about getting those details in place so that we can invest behind it. And then to close from me, just the international trade and the prospects. Look, we completely need to gear up for success in all of these things. And actually, it ought to play to the UK's strengths, I think, because we've got in the UK not just the innovative products and the technical capability, but also our services industry know-how. So if we can get that locked together, that's a brilliant export right around the world to go about how do you go about decarbonising industrialised economies and so on. COP later this year clearly is a major opportunity to showcase the UK. So what we really want to do is create a race to the top, showcase how British businesses are leading the charge, and then help to drive some of those domestic and global policy outcomes that will help us lead the way. So I think organisations like the CBI that we've just recently got together around the G7 with some of our sister federations around the world and tackled and lent into some of those harder to address issues, coal, the hard to abate sectors, carbon pricing, thorny issues, but if we can get some international consensus on those, it really tees us up for success. So that's it from me, Katie. I think, look, got to be strong domestically to win internationally. Don't assume it'll just happen by accident. We really need the detail, pace and momentum behind it. And then let's shape the international agenda in a way that gears up the UK for success.
Brilliant. Thank you, Matthew. Claire?
Hi, good morning, everybody. Great to be here. As others have said, this is a critical turning point in climate change, and we're at a really important time for the UK. We've got this fantastic opportunity of COP to really showcase the global leadership that we have in tackling climate change. We're very proud at Drax, a British company, to play a key part in that, and we have transformed the UK's biggest coal-fired power station in North Yorkshire to become Europe's biggest decarbonisation project. And we are very, very proud that we are, in doing so, enabling the UK to meet its climate change targets. So by converting coal to sustainable biomass, we've actually protected thousands of jobs in the north and particularly in the Humber, and we've kept the lights on across the UK. And now we're looking forward to our next great innovation, and we can make an even more valuable contribution to climate change. You may not have heard about negative emissions before, but this will be impossible to reach net zero without the technologies that deliver negative emissions. And experts in the Climate Change Committee agree that if we don't do something about net zero and remove carbon emissions, we are not going to reach our targets. So at Drax, we've spent many years developing industrial scale negative emissions technology, which is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. It's called BECCS. And we are shovel ready. We are making partnerships with big international companies like the Japanese. We are ready to complete this pioneering project, which will be the world's largest carbon capture project in the world. And we are ready to go, and we are looking forward to the government providing some investment frameworks and support that we would need, just like wind really took off when the government gave it that support, just like the French did with nuclear. Not only can we really boost this technology and lead the world, but we can also export it across the world and help other nations really reduce their carbon emissions. So we're really excited about these new technologies. We're really excited about negative emissions. And in fact, next week, we are launching a coalition of negative emissions with a report from McKinsey to show just how critical investment is in these negative emissions technology, which needs to be scaled up urgently. The prize is huge, absolutely huge. And we've got fantastic opportunities for jobs, protecting heavy industries in the north, creating new green jobs, and we stand ready to invest. So we are ready on a global stage, and our ambitions don't stop there. We're also working with Bechtel in identifying new opportunities to build BECCS elsewhere across the world. So we're ready to rock. We're ready for negative emissions, and we're really looking forward. Let's announce this at COP. Let's get on with it and show the global leadership that UK PLC has got for the world in this critical issue of addressing climate change. Thanks.
Thank you, Claire. Now let's go to Eamon for the final, the opening remarks.
Thank you, Katie. Pleasure to be here. So my remarks, I'm actually going to concentrate on something you alluded to in your introduction, namely the fiendishly named carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which I'm going to call CBAMs for short. So for the uninitiated, CBAMs help to tackle climate change by essentially making polluters responsible for the costs of the emissions they create. And that's something which I think the government should be focusing on a lot more than it currently is, especially as we run up to COP26. So they essentially work by applying a charge on on imports which have not already accounted for the cost of their emissions in the countries where they were originally made. And I think the UK CBAM would be an extremely powerful tool to persuade other governments to adopt climate policies which are as ambitious as the ones that we have here in the UK and should be proud of having. And I think one of the best ways to think about it is to consider, say, the following example. Imagine you're a Chinese steel exporter and you're now facing an extra charge to send your products to the UK because of the new CBAM. So how do you think the Chinese government might react to that? Well, they might just, decide to let businesses take the tariff on the chin, pay it, and we all move on. Or they might decide that they'd rather have the revenue of that CBAM instead of going to HMRC. They quite like to have it for themselves, which they're perfectly entitled to if they enact a robust carbon price of their own. And then what that would do is when we have that carbon price in place is that the whole economy then has an impetus to avoid paying it by switching to cleaner technologies, which are less reliant on fossil fuels, if at all. So in this sense, I think a CBAM is something that we can certainly adopt at home, but we can use it to hasten decarbonisation everywhere. And setting one up certainly won't be easy, but I think it's perfectly possible. And it's always better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. And I also think it would be remiss not to consider the current political dynamics around CBAMs. So if we look over to Europe, we can see the EU is really striding ahead here, should soon be setting out its top level thoughts on what one should look like. Similarly in America, Joe Biden's made some overtures to them in the past. So to my mind, the direction is inevitable. And so to not be part of that conversation really risks the UK ceding a lot of the good climate leadership capital, which it's managed to build up in recent years through the Climate Change Act, net zero, all of that. So yeah, I mean, my sort of plea to government is to really sort of get involved on these, start joining the conversation, joining the debate, because I think it's, as I say, I think the direction is inevitable, and it would be potentially difficult for us to be bounced into something later down the line. So yeah, to wrap up in conclusion, I think that a CBAM is kind of necessary so that when we're saying we're decarbonising, we can be confident that we genuinely are, instead of just pushing our pollution elsewhere, which could be the case as we ramp up climate action going forwards.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Eamon. I'm looking forward to chewing those thoughts over the panel as we go on. It's definitely, as you say, one of the areas where there doesn't yet seem to be agreement. So just before we get to that, I thought to begin, I mean, Bim, in your opening remarks, you were talking about how the fact that when we step away, if we're talking about how we incorporate a green trade, green agenda of our trade policy, it ultimately comes to what does the UK have that can help other countries? And I wanted to maybe go to you, Matthew, to ultimately say, what do you think the biggest assets are right now when it comes to the UK and that green revolution, when it comes to what we're going to have in negotiations in the future?
Do you want me to have a first crack at that then? Okay. Yeah. I mean, look, I think in terms of the UK's biggest assets, I think for me, it's kind of really why we need to just get pace and momentum in this agenda. I think one of our biggest assets, look, we've got a real opportunity in a shade under 6 months' time now with COP26 to just be putting the UK completely on the world stage and showing the way, as we were able to do recently with the G7. And that, for me, I think, is the biggest thing that we can play in our hand. If we can get the most pace and momentum in making progress right now, to be able to say, look, the UK is on this. It's not easy, but we're on it. And then to be able to demonstrate that to the rest of the world. I think that is the most powerful and most persuasive way when we're looking to secure international agreements, shape trade policy, shape regulation, and so on. You kind of got to be on the front foot as the home nation, if you were, to be able then to, through power of persuasion, but also demonstration, to be able to bring others on board too. So that for me would be the thing. We've got to be leading from the front from the UK in order to be able to bring others with us on the journey.
Yeah, I mean, look, leading's very, very important, and COP26 gives us an opportunity to do that. But I think that really we have to be quite precise about the areas in which the UK is better, and better in a technical sense, than most other countries. I pick two main areas. One is technology and science. The vaccine rollout, though a different subject, has shown and reminded the world how good we are at science with our top universities. And I think we need to be doubling down on that sort of work and showing that in a climate change context. And that applies to all sorts of renewable energy, requires to carbon capture and storage, like we were hearing about Drax. It applies to lots of different things, but I think that needs to be a focus. And the second thing is the City of London. Now, I'm prejudiced because I worked in the city before I became an MP, but the City of London combined with technical scientific ability to come up with new technologies, those two things combined, there are very few, if any other countries that can do that. And I think that is what we need to be selling, not just leading from the front, but more specifically saying, we have a unique combination and ecosystem that nobody else has. We're going to now take that to other countries.
Claire, do you agree with that? I mean, I think technology, I mean, we can talk about CCUS as well, so carbon capture and storage and aspects of this. It does feel as though that's somewhere where the UK could have a lot of momentum when it comes to technology, and also obviously it links to things like electric cars. So what's your take?
Absolutely. I mean, the great thing is the UK leads the world in renewable energies. I mean, look at the fantastic story of wind and solar. I mean, we literally lead the world. We are leading in terms of renewable power coming from non-fossil fuel sources. And again, at Drax, we have come off coal-fired power stations. The UK is leading the world in coming off fossil fuels. So we are actually doing it. And in terms of these new technologies, we're not just talking about it, we are actually doing them. We are doing this at Drax. And as been said, we're working with academics as well. That's all been part, and we have got real tangible commercial partnerships now. We're not talking about them. We've just done a deal with the Japanese. So this is real. All we need now is the regulatory frameworks, and off we go, just like wind did. I mean, so we are ready. And when I sit with colleagues from other energy industries, we stand ready to invest. We're not just talking about it, we are ready to go. And I do hope that these big international companies, if you're not given the signals from government to invest here, they will take their capital somewhere else. So we've got a unique opportunity. The clock's ticking. So let's make the most of COP and really demonstrate that we can do this stuff, and we can do it. We are doing it now. Let's just get on with it.
And Claire, just on that, you mentioned wind power. I mean, I think we all will here remember the Prime Minister's speech about, making Britain the Saudi Arabia of wind power.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you think it's that type of big kind of gesture, or kind of a force from the government? We need to get some of this stuff going.
Yes, particularly on things like carbon capture. We could lead the world. We could export these technologies. We could do it all over the world. We can help other countries from Drax, help come off coal, which is the huge emissions emitter. All of these huge countries in the world need to come off these fossil fuels. So these new technologies to reduce negative emissions are absolutely the way forward. And UK PLC has got the lead. So let's do it.
And now we're getting a nice range of questions already coming in, so please do keep with that. But just to remind you how to do so, you could obviously email events@spectator.co.uk or ask a question by typing into the text box. I'm going to come to some of those shortly. Eamon, I just wanted to come to you briefly. Ultimately, when it comes to, I suppose, promoting low carbon trade, you previously suggested that ultimately you need to remove barriers and tariffs. So is that the type of intervention that you think we need from the government? What do you think would be the most powerful thing? Obviously it's investment. So
definitely, yeah. I think on the whole sort of tariff question, and to give the government its credit, I think it has done a good job on this. So if we're having this event maybe a year ago, I'd have less encouraging things to say. But the introduction of the UK global tariff, I think Liz Truss has done a very good job in terms of cutting the amount of tariffs and the simplicity around them on a lot of environmental goods and services. There are definitely still some where we can go further. So electric vehicles springs to mind, bicycles, things like that. I don't see a good reason at all for having tariffs on a lot of goods, but particularly ones that are going to help lower the cost of the transition to a net zero economy. So if Bim and his colleagues can put the pressure on there to get that kind of get the job done on tariff simplification and lowering, and also sort of non-tariff barriers as well. So things around rules of origin, which I know could become particularly thorny, things like electric vehicles, at least in the EU trade agreement. Certainly that's something which is absolutely within the gift of government, and it could just do it tomorrow if it really wanted to. So more work there, I think, would be brilliant.
And Bim, let's talk about carbon leakage, another way of describing that phrase that we were talking about earlier when it comes to the idea of a carbon border tax. Now, Eamon's highlighted already, lots of the arguments for it. And I think that there is a sense, if you are going to sell net zero to not just your domestic audience, but particularly UK businesses, there has to be a sense that you are not going to be punished because other countries can have cheaper practices. You often hear those figures who are the most resistant to the net zero agenda. So, for example, Tony Abbott was recently on Spectator TV saying one of his concerns about Australia going faster than they are is you could weaken economies in the West if places like China don't follow suit. So do you think a carbon border tax is something that the Prime Minister should support?
I think we should definitely consider it strongly, but I would put it in two categories. There are countries like China, which are competitors of the highest class and energy and ability. And then you have other countries which are significantly poorer countries. Now, I don't think we should be treating China and, say, a very poor country in, say, sub-Saharan Africa the same way when it comes to this sort of thing, because actually, those countries are at different stages of development. And even though their environmental record in certain instances may be similar, I think all of us would intuitively feel a certain unfairness with treating certain very poor countries in that way. However, even if we separate those two things out, the key point is this: if we decide to do this without certain technologies being freely available or being cost effective, for example, in China making steel, making industrial amounts, no pun intended, industrial amounts of steel and flooding the world market, if it is not economically viable for them to produce steel in a cleaner way, if we are the country that decides to do that, I guarantee you there'll be other Western countries that do not do that, because they will say, well, hold on, our industry or our country wants cheaper steel. So even if you separate out the sort of big polluters and the more economically successful polluters with the poorer countries, you've still got a lot of problems. In relation to the poorer countries, we need to make sure that through aid, through other mechanisms, we are giving them the ability to be able to afford the technologies that we're very excitedly trying to sell all over the world.
Eamon, what do you say to that? Because clearly one of the problems is logistically something, there's a reason it's such a thorny topic. We can agree with the fact that it would fix lots of things, but it could be very hard to reach an agreement without perhaps becoming almost a protectionist ring of certain countries doing it.
Certainly, yeah, and I think that is probably, you know, the biggest stumbling block, and it's one that we need to tread delicately around. But also, I think let's not get too bogged down on it, because I think there are good reasons for this, and it's perfectly. I think there's a lot of precedent, at least in WTO law, that will allow this, and if we want to make sure that we're not hammering, you know, the poorest countries which need sort of the access to free trade the most, then I think we can absolutely take some measures to protect them from some of the downsides. So first of all, we could see which goods we apply it to straight away, and make sure they're not too trade exposed with those poorer countries. The UK already gives, I think, tariff-free and quota-free access to 46 less developed countries anyway under WTO rules. So I think there are sort of carve-outs we can do to make sure that you know, we kind of capture the most amount of benefits from a carbon border adjustment mechanism without sort of piling the costs onto others.
Matthew, do you think it's going to be?
No, Katie, just one extra thought on this for me would just be to say, look, this may or not have its place. I would sort of put above it that push for. This is one of the reasons why we're just so keen to get as much international sort of progress and consensus as possible in terms of the overall sort of framework and so on. And the more you can achieve that, for me, then some of the border taxes and so on, look, they may have a part to play, but it sort of lessens, and some of the issues we've just been talking about with Eamon and BIM and so on, you know, those concerns are going to be moderated a little bit, the more you have that sort of consensus and consistency of international approach. So I'd go for it in a sort of 1-2 combo like that sort of thing, with the push for the international rules as much as possible.
Yeah, and use COP26 as the place to really get that going. Okay, now I'm going to go to a few audience questions and then slip a few of mine in as we go also. Claire, I think this one for you first, I think. So Andrew asks, many companies like Drax and governments like the UK are increasingly taking positive actions to achieve challenging ESG targets, but one of the difficulties is to measure and prove what they're doing. And they say blockchain is a perfect technology solution to create a global tracking system, which would eliminate the current fuzzy overlapping data, you know, double counting. The US is talking about this. Is this something the UK should be talking about?
I think it's really interesting. I think it's really important to track progress, etc. And I think it's a really interesting idea. And I think, you know, I encourage other options to look at this. So I think it's a really good idea. Yes.
Okay. And would that be helpful in terms of, I suppose, do you think it is an issue almost being able to prove what you're doing with lots of different, you know, double counting and things like that?
Yes, absolutely. No, I think it's very important, and also to give credibility and transparency to governments and to the consumer. Absolutely.
Now we're talking about obviously how this green agenda can be wrapped up in trade deals. So Luke asks, how green is the recent Australia trade deal? Now this is the UK's first bespoke trade deal since ultimately leaving the EU. It's one that's actually made from scratch. And I think it's been interesting because on the UK side, there's definitely some who think they've had to put a lot of time actually into getting various commitments in relation to COP26, but perhaps not anything that binding. Which I think, depending on who you speak to, is a good use of time, and others think maybe they could have pushed more some other stuff. So I suppose maybe if we go to BIM first on that, how green do you think the deal is, given that Australia often are criticised for their own coal use?
So I think that you can look at this one of two ways. It is moving in a green direction. So for example, in agriculture, the requirements are over the next 15 years, I think. So that's quite a long time. There's a lot of improvements on both sides to do in that regard. So I think that it's definitely moving in the right direction. On the other hand, we have to be very straightforward about this. Australia is a major minerals producer, mining. We are not in the same way. So we can't it's going to be difficult to get Australia to agree to certain things in the way that we would more easily agree to them, because those sectors in our economy are very small, if not non-existent. So that's not the way I'd look at it per se. How I'd think about this, and I need to look at the detailed provisions on this, and actually I'm getting a detailed briefing on this later this week, is to what extent, when it comes to industry, is Australia tying itself to specific ends, or are there commitments they've made to discussing, to engaging in a global way? And that's what I'll be looking at. And I don't know the answer to that at the moment.
Claire, I just want to ask you about the, I mean, on that topic, I mean, the international phase out of coal, as Bim has touched on, certain countries are going to find that easier in terms of what their industry are, and Australia is one that is going to find it harder. But you're talking about how the UK can lead, and UK companies can ultimately lead that standard. So do you think that's actually somewhere where the UK will be able to bring other countries such as Australia on side by showing that it's doable here?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, the UK leads in terms of closing down its coal-fired power stations. I mean, we've got very, very few now. We're almost entirely on renewable. So we have got a fantastic story to tell. And, you know, at Drax, we are very open to sharing that expertise and knowledge across the world. We lead the world. I mean, we're the only coal-fired power station that has absolutely transformed into using bioenergy. So we can export that knowledge and expertise to other countries, particularly the poorer countries.
And just on that, just Alan has asked in relation to Drax, and obviously looking, you know, he says, as burning wood produces CO2, carbon capture and storage is not yet feasible. You know, how is that maybe better? But how is that one? So, you know, are we all the way there yet? Do you mean there's some questions over there?
Well, we've been doing the technology for over a year now. We've got partners. We're all ready to go. It is proven, and we have the support and endorsement of the Climate Change Committee. Only last week, they published a report that bioenergy and carbon capture is a critical pathway to achieving the emissions target for the UK. So we feel very confident that we can do it.
Now, Eamon, we're talking about market-based solutions, but Wilfred, I think, is asking a question when it comes to the cost of net zero. So who is going to meet the cost for public sector changes to electric vehicles and the introduction of net zero heating systems? So ultimately, lots of excitement around COP26, and I'm going to come to Bim as well on this one. But there is a question over the eventual price tag and how this is sold. So when you're looking at ways, I mean, you know, solutions to pushing this agenda through, is that one of the areas where you're a bit, you know, I think it probably looks trickier?
So on the public question, well, I guess that would be taxpayers ultimately. But yeah, I think maybe sort of just getting to the sort of gist of the question itself. Certainly there are going to be costs of getting to net zero, and I don't think anybody disputes that. You know, if there weren't any costs, then we probably wouldn't need to be having this debate today and all of the policies that the government has come out with, because that's where it is. But there are a great deal of costs for not getting there as well, and we need to be cognizant of those. And I think another thing to keep fresh in our mind is that you know, if we come up with ways of decarbonising more effectively and more cost effectively, that's better, and that's sort of where I guess, you know, I try and come in with some of the policies we're recommending. Hence things like cutting tariffs on environmental goods and services. You know, that would lower the costs of getting to net zero, and things like that. And so yeah, I think it's a really difficult question, and I must say also that the price tag comes down every year seemingly, because of the progress of technologies they're making. I mean, look at offshore wind, look at solar panels, batteries for electric vehicles. They've just absolutely tumbled in the last 10 years. And I think woe betide anyone who sort of you know, thinks that it's going to be as expensive as we thought it was, you know, 2 years ago when the net zero target was set. I think it's almost certainly going to be lower. All the sort of forecasts would say that. So yeah, I don't know, Bim wants to add anything to that as well.
Yeah, I'll go to Bim and then to Matthew. Bim, just, you know, touching on that, so who's going to pay? Because I think it's worth pointing out that when it comes to that domestic audience, we see lots of polling which says, oh, people, you know, love the green agenda, and actually there isn't for all the talk that it's a harder sell in some areas, there seems to be general enthusiasm, but it does change when you often drum into the details. So if you say, well, should the government tell you you're not allowed a gas boiler, then should you foot the bill? And support does drop quite swiftly. And that's similarly, I think the current cost of electric cars is something which does not hold very well if someone had to change. So who do you think is going to foot the bill?
Well, what Eamon said around the cost dropping is right, but I think there's a bigger problem, which is the practicality of doing certain things. So the big area, I think, for this is around heat and buildings. There is no way of sugarcoating, if you are going to have to insulate hundreds of thousands of buildings, that will be an invasive thing to do, even if you put cost to one side. So I think that we need to face up to that. In terms of who pays, I think that in order to maintain public support for this, we are going to have probably the government is going to have to pay, and ultimately taxpayers, for probably a majority of people, not just the very poorest. I think a majority of people need to be quite heavily subsidized, particularly when it comes to heat, buildings, electric cars. I'm hoping that the market might do enough work, but even if it doesn't, then we may have to provide some subsidy there. And there are other things as well. How I'd pay for that is by probably putting levies on, whether, I don't know, a carbon adjustment tax, as we've been talking about, or maybe on certain heavy polluting industries, putting levies, so as much as possible, the cost is borne by those who are contributing most of the problem. But I think that we need to be very honest and say, if we want people to go along with this, we are going to have to make it practically as easy as possible, even when something's invasive, and financially as easy as possible. Because if we don't do that, politically, for whatever major party, it's going to be incredibly difficult to get support.
Matthew?
Yeah, just a few things on that. Building on what both Eamon and Bim have just said, I think, firstly, there is a little bit of a role where government could lead the way on some of that retrofit, for example, around social housing and so on, to really get the sort of market going in that. That would be a helpful thing. I completely agree on how do you get the consumer incentives hooked up behind this, as Bim was just saying. You know, look, you take my mother and father, retired homeowners, for example, a position where they probably could do all of this stuff, but what really tips them over to sort of saying, yeah, I'm going to go for it, sort of thing. So I think those consumer incentives are really important as part of this. And then, as Eamon's point, look, the cost is coming down on these things. So I think that is where the phasing is really important. And it's where bodies like the Committee on Climate Change and so on, they're completely right to say, of course, the sooner you act, the less expensive and the easier it is overall, sort of thing, if we're thinking about this on a 2050 time horizon. But also, what should we be really focusing on now and getting going? And then where is the sort of the moment right to get going on other stuff? I think that sequencing and phasing is really important too.
Now, I just want to get two questions on nuclear. So I'm just going to bring them up at the same time and then go to the panel. So first is Charles asks, is nuclear the only sane energy policy for the electric generation? And then Paul asks, since electricity generation is such a big part of the problem, why don't we just go nuclear like France? Claire, have you got thoughts on this one?
Sorry. Well, nuclear is not my area of expertise, but I think my general view is that to have a mix of energy sources and technologies is probably a good thing to have in terms of security supply and sustainability. But I think probably Matthew and others have a better view about the ins and outs of the nuclear industry. But it's an interesting dilemma for the government, isn't it? Security supply against sustainability issues, and we know that we have had some issues and some problems with the nuclear fleet. So I'd be interested with other panelists what their views are.
Yeah, Matthew.
Yeah, look, violent agreement with what Claire just said, actually. I mean, I think nuclear absolutely has a role to play as part of the mix, but I would completely pursue it as a sort of not all eggs in one basket kind of approach. I think being reasonably technology neutral on this is a good thing with many different sources of supply, but with nuclear completely amongst those.
Now, Claire, one question I wanted to ask you was, ultimately, we're talking about kind of exporting net zero, about setting an example to other countries. But to what extent do you think Britain needs to get its own house in order when it comes to the energy system to be in the best place to do that?
Well, I think we can do both, and I think we should do both. And I think, as I've said before, you know, the energy industry stands ready to invest, and we have lots of fantastic projects, lots of technologies ready to go, and we are looking forward to. I think this is the critical year to have some policy and frameworks to actually get on and do it. I think this could be a great year, and I would love to see these announcements at COP to really show the way for UK PLC.
Matthew.
Yeah, look, I was just going to say on that a couple of thoughts, really. One is, I think that is absolutely right, but let's be under no illusion that, you know, lots of the companies who operate in this space do so in many, many countries right around the world, and the UK is sort of competing for investment that they have to play. I think that many of them are keen to put it to play in the UK market, but they kind of want those details filled in to enable them to press go on the investment. Otherwise, it's in danger of going elsewhere, sort of thing. So I think getting that regulatory detail to allow companies to invest is really, really important. And then just to sort of illustrate it in a sense, making sure that those prizes don't slip through our fingers. One of the easiest things for people just to visualize and wrap your head around is electric vehicles and so on. But that is going to be a major, major market, both in the UK, in Europe, and right around the world in the years to come. The UK ought to be pretty well placed to take advantage of that. We've got a strong history and heritage of automotive manufacture and so on, lots of the innovation and the technology that Bim was describing in his opening remarks. But the reality is that is something like probably about an 18 billion export prize over the next decade. But unless we get on and get the gigafactories built in the UK, those prizes are going to slip through our fingers and they'll go elsewhere. Now, look, that replicates then across loads of the different types of technologies, but it's just an illustration of we need to get going now in order to realize the prizes that will flow from that in the years to come.
Bim.
I agree with that. What I, if I may, ask of my other panelists is, what is it? What are the specific things that they'd like from government in relation to whether it be electric vehicles, certain other things, to get this more investment and FDI coming into the country? Because I hear a lot of sort of, we need to do this, we need to do that, we're ready. But okay, what specific things do people want from government so that I can take them back to my colleagues when I go to the House later this afternoon?
Yeah, well, Bim, I'll pop in the chat and drop you a line if it's okay from our side. What we've done recently is completely designed to be sort of going with the grain and in the spirit of what the government's ambitions are around the 10-point plan, which we completely agree with. And the plan is against each of those, can we fill a little bit more detail? So we've got a little bit of grid we can send it through. But for people on the line now, I think just to illustrate the point, as I said, look, on green buildings, that retrofit piece, can we have the comprehensive heat and building strategy that's been promised? Let's get that out even before the summer recess, for example. On carbon capture, some of the stuff that Claire was talking about, the actual business models that companies can invest against, I think the sort of the RAB model, or if it's going to be that and so on, that'd be great. And on the electric vehicles, both the delivery plan for the rollout in the UK, as well as those gigafactories that are a critical sort of enabling technology and supportive part of the overall infrastructure. Look, those are just three. We've done it against each of the 10-point plan, but I'm happy to share that with people on the line, with you and others. But it's kind of, I think it's that thinking and the mentality that we need to just be on a relentless basis now in the sort of years to come. We agree with the direction of travel. What are the actions that we need to take in the next 3, 6, 12 months? And if we just have that thought process going at all times, that will be really sort of impatient and relentless pace that would chase this down.
Clara, those are the type of things you also like to see, or is there anything you'd add to that? When
no, absolutely.
Very busy afternoon.
Absolutely, and just talking about carbon capture, you know, we just need the regulatory mechanism that that Matthew's talked about. We stand ready to invest, and as Ben will know too well, coming from the city, you know, that investment needs signals from government to give confidence for investors to get the investment. Otherwise, it goes elsewhere. So we need these really specific signals on investment, and we're ready to go.
Eamon, I suppose looking to COP26, it's clearly where everyone on this panel thinks, you know, it's the where you're going to build momentum ahead. It's an opportunity to really show UK leadership. We think in Glasgow, unless it goes into a hybrid form with all the uncertainty on COVID. What do you think are the most important, you know, announcements, commitments that you would like to see that you think would really change the picture of where we're going with this?
So I think, I mean, first and foremost, countries coming forward with stronger and yeah, more ambitious pledges on what they want to do for cutting their own emissions. We've already had quite a few of those in advance of it, and especially when we thought it was going to be in 2020. So China, South Korea, a few other places. So I think that is, it's difficult to look past those as being the most important things. We've seen what the power of just setting a net zero target has been in the UK, set 2 years ago almost, and yeah, it's just kind of completely revolutionized business world. Everybody knows that that's the goal and that's what we need to aim for. So I think that's that's the best thing that we can do, and hopefully the Prime Minister and the UK COP team are going to be absolutely relentless in campaigning for that and getting as strong and ambitious pledges from other countries as possible. I guess another thing around sort of climate finance for developing nations is always going to be important, and sort of leveraging those countries into the debate more, although obviously a lot of them have been at the forefront anyway, because a lot of them are the ones that are already being affected mostly by climate change and stand to be in the future. So yeah, I think hopefully, we know the Prime Minister's excellent at his rhetoric, and hopefully he can use that to catalyse further support among the developed world to really ramp up ambition on climate change, because the UK has been a leader. And we are being now joined by other nations and blocs like the EU, but I think there's still a long way to go, and the UK can show how it has decarbonised so effectively, and other nations can learn from that.
And Matthew, if you kind of go back to some of the points you were earlier making, or when it comes to having ultimately that international discussion with so many countries there, what do you think is the real takeaway the government need to have from it?
On the international front, I mean, look, for me, I think it's about leaning into some of there are things that are genuinely difficult in here. The role of coal, some of the genuinely hard to abate sectors, aviation would be amongst those, and things like that. Carbon pricing, ferociously complex, and everyone's got an opinion on. I think the key thing is to get stuck into some of those difficult things, but then I think my view is where we and others have got a role to play. And actually, if business can help to role model some of that international consensus and say, look, here's something we can get behind, kind of what we were trying to do in ahead of the G7 sort of meeting recently in Cornwall and so on. I think if business can say that, yeah, we're up for this and we could work along these lines, hopefully then that gives encouragement to governments of those nations as well. And if we can get stuck into those kind of issues, I think that will make real progress.
And Viv, I think sticking with obviously the international conversation we're heading to in this year of COP, you talked earlier a little bit about how you would differentiate between poorer countries and countries like China. And China is clearly controversial to many in the Tory party when it comes to what balance Boris Johnson should strike in working with China, given its record on climate change, bringing people on side when also there's lots of, human rights abuses also. So what do you think the government should or will be doing ahead of COP? But there's going to be a lot of focus and scrutiny on how they go about.
Yes, I think it'll be tricky. My view, which is contrary to some people who have more extreme views in my party on this subject, is that China isn't going anywhere. We're going to have to engage with them. They're a big country, and if we want to get anywhere close to achieving what we need to on climate, which is a global problem, not a British problem, it's a global problem, then we're going to have a good relationship with them and work with them very, very closely. And I know that Alex Sharma, president of COP26, is doing that. Indeed, I am having a conversation with some senior Chinese people, politicians, on this very subject in a couple of weeks' time. So I think what we need to do is, when we're dealing with China, make sure we deal with the issue in hand and deal with that frankly, in a relatively isolated, specific way. And when we come to talking about human rights, we should definitely do so. And I know the Foreign Secretary feels very strongly about these things, and so he should, as does the Prime Minister. But we shouldn't allow that conversation to dominate absolutely everything we do, because if we do that, it might make us feel better, but we will not achieve what we need to on climate. As I say, this is a global problem. The UK is about 1 to 2% of global emissions. We will only deal with this problem with all the technology in the world if China and the United States are doing the right things and doing it in the right time frame. So it's my view that we have to engage very positively with China in this regard. That also is the case in relation to their industry. And we should use any sort of carbon adjustment mechanism or carbon pricing or anything like that. We should use as part of a carrot and stick approach to say with China, look, we want to trade with you, we want to engage with you, but you have to do it in a fair way on the right standards. And they will have to move in that direction because they need to export their products to us.
Eamon, do you think that that's the type of approach the UK government is going to have to consider? We can look at things on a very domestic level, but clearly, much larger countries with much larger carbon footprints, are completely crucial to this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely, and one can look at the work of, say, Professor Sajid Helm, who's really kind of led the charge for carbon border adjustments, among other people. But yeah, I mean, that's why I come back to what I said in my opening remarks, is that we can get to net zero and pat ourselves on the back, but if the rest of the world isn't doing it, then I think rightly some of the sort of more skeptical people of the whole climate agenda, I think that is something that you sort of have to say fair enough on. So then it's sort of, incumbent upon policymakers and all people involved in that to come up with those solutions which that we can do to influence change right around the world. And I think a carbon border adjustment mechanism is one of those. And interestingly, I think it is one of those policies which does unite a lot of different and disparate wings of parties or Westminster itself. We had Dr. Liam Fox making the case for them at the CPS a few weeks ago. That was followed up by an op-ed by Amber Rudd and Andrea Leadsom. And so, I think there are lots of different ways to approach things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Hopefully that sort of is a reason to be optimistic about them as sort of effective tools which we can adopt today to drive decarbonisation all around the world.
And Claire, do you think when it comes to, I suppose, making some of these things happen, when we're talking about the fact it has to be a global effort, do you think the government can lean on industry more in a way when it comes to, I suppose, showing other countries or, foreign companies that there is a path to doing this? You can rely on people's goodwill and say, well, look at this David Attenborough documentary. But you can also say, well, actually, this is something that can be very prosperous for you as a company, and maybe industry is better placed to really be able to point to results like that.
Yes, I mean, I think industry is the right tool to take this forward, and any encouragement from government to do that, absolutely. But I mean, we host lots of visits to our power station. We've come off coal. We're the first big coal-fired power station to go to bioenergy, and we have lots of folks from all over the world come to our power station, and we welcome them. We put on tours. We encourage that. We're very, very happy to share with government our technology, and with the poorer nations. We're really up to playing our part in that, because they are part of the problem, but they're also part of the solution. So I think the more that we can work, the clock is ticking. So we are really up for sharing our technology and to have that partnership with government. It's about partnership, isn't it? It's about partnership with industry. We're doing some great international partnerships with the Japanese and with others. We're really, really keen to make this an international technology approach to tackling the biggest issue, which is climate change. So I think it's fantastic, yeah.
Now, we've only got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to give one question to Bim, then I'm going to ask everyone and just ultimately say, if there could be one change, and it doesn't have to be on a COP, just what you think will be the most meaningful thing that could happen to really kind of make sure that this rhetoric about green trade policy becomes, impactful. So if everyone start thinking about that now. But Bim, I just want to go to you, because
why do I not get a chance to start thinking?
You're also going to, but you get a nastier question too. You
Right.
talked about a stick and carrot approach. Now we talked about the carrot, we talked about the stick, but I wondered, when we're talking about holding countries responsible for heavily polluting practices, do you think when it comes to UK trade policy that the UK should ultimately not do trade deals with certain countries if they have a bad record? Now, we know in terms of the policy, there has to be some commitments sewn into these deals right now, but do you think it should go a bit further? I mean, should the UK really, if it's leading by example, do deals with countries with dubious records on this?
I think that you should never rule out any option, but I'd be very reluctant to take that approach. The best way, in my view, is that you do trade deals, but you have the right mechanisms and obligations contained within them. Because let's take the alternative. Let's just say there's a country that isn't playing ball, they aren't doing the right things, as judged not just by the UK, but by any international standard. And we say, right, we're not doing a trade deal with you. Okay, it's not going to stop them doing what they're doing. It's not going to change that dynamic. What you need to do is through engagement with them, help them. And if so need be, you might have to help contribute to financially if they're a poor country, is we have to make sure those countries do the right thing when it comes to the products they're producing for trade, because ultimately, unless you can engage with people in that sort of positive way, you don't get anywhere. So I'd be very reluctant to take that approach, though I understand completely why some people may think it's a good idea. I think it's ultimately self-defeating. Okay.
Now I'm going to go around the panel for just a final reflection on the way I suppose to make green and global trade in the UK a world leader. So I'm going to tell everyone now the order. We're going to go Matthew, we're going to go Eamon, we're going to go Claire, and then Bim's going to give us our final answer. So Matthew, can you go first?
Ben, you managed to talk yourself into getting the most thinking time after all. That's very, very canny. I would say, look, here for me, I would say, look, I would actually start with unleashing the innovation, the technology, and the investment. So actually you get the sort of commercial interest and intent and commitment right behind it. Look, trade deals can be phenomenally helpful, but I think if you've got all of that going on behind it and sort of unleash the power of business into it, I think that's the way to make real progress.
Eamon?
Okay, so I've been talking about one acronym all day, so I'm going to throw another one out there. Right. The ACCTS, which is the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability. It's an international initiative launched by New Zealand and a host of other countries, and I would love to see the UK joining it. It's something which the Board of Trade has recommended, Liz Truss does, and essentially two main things it tries to do: cuts tariffs on and non-tariff barriers on green goods and services, and also seeks to phase out subsidies for polluting activities like energy generation or agriculture, which I see no reason for the UK or any country to be subsidising. So yes, let's try and seek to join that, and then use COP26 to catalyse other nations to do the same.
Brilliant, thank you. Claire?
I'm afraid I'm going to reiterate what Matthew said. Enable, empower business. Yeah, enable the technologies, the investment, and just watch it go. Just like wind power, you know, trade will happen, business will happen if you empower the commercial and the technology and the investment, and it will happen.
Okay. Bim, you've got your final airtime.
I would
pick up, I suppose, on any of the others. I think that was an interesting suggestion from Eamon there about something the government could consider.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think about that. I think it's very interesting. I'm persuaded that what we need to really unleash private sector investment is a clear, RAB model, a clear capital model for how to invest in new technologies that everybody knows is very open and can attract international investment as much as domestic. Because in a couple of years, if the investment has not materialized, then we can look back and say, well, you said if we did this, it would work, and it hasn't. So I think that is one thing we can do. And on the building side, the domestic front, I would very clearly come out and reassure millions of people across the country that we aren't about to give them a £10,000 tax to replace all their boilers overnight, because I think that at the moment is probably, a danger that people will turn against the green agenda, which really would be very, very damaging. So I think that we need to, internationally, we need to get that FDI in by providing a clear investment model. And then domestically, we need to reassure people that these changes on domestic heat and buildings will be done with a lot of government support.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because as you say, if right now there's a lot of support out there for this agenda, but it doesn't take much, and you can have a situation where actually it has a lot harder work if the perception changes. Now, with that, I want to thank our panel very much for their time today. So thank you to Bim, Matthew, Claire, and Eamon. I really appreciate you finding the time. Thanks to Drax for being a partner on this event. And it concludes our summit, Road to COP26. So I want to thank every one of our speakers from the 3 panel sessions today, and just remind everyone that if you have missed any of today's panels, or you simply want to watch one again, you can watch them on replay on the website. So again, couldn't get through every single question, but I think we did manage to cover at least the breadth of ideas and queries coming in. So with that, thank you very much.